the screams have long since faded from the mist-covered shores of medieval Europe. But if you listen carefully to the wind across ancient battlefields, you might still hear the echoes of something far worse than the clash of swords. The Vikings conquered with steel and flame, yes, but their true weapon was something that made death itself seem merciful by comparison. When the longships appeared on the horizon, warriors knew they faced two possibilities: victory or an honorable death in battle. But for the women watching from the settlement walls, there were no honorable outcomes, only degrees of horror that would make the grave seem like sanctuary. What happened to the wives of defeated warriors wasn't just brutality. It was systematic, calculated, industrial in its efficiency, and it was considered perfectly legal. If this exploration of medieval history resonates with you, please subscribe. Your support allows us to uncover these forgotten chapters that shaped our world. Also, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The year is 847. The monastery bells of St. Bertin have fallen silent, not because the monks have finished their prayers, but because there are no monks left to pray. Ragnar's fleet has done its work efficiently. 43 holy men lie scattered across the altar stones, their blood mixing with spilled sacramental wine. But the real story isn't written in the chronicle kept by Brother Aldrich, the sole survivor who hid beneath the scriptorium floor. His account ends with the word slaughter and then blank pages. What he couldn't bring himself to record was what happened next, when the Viking attention turned from the monastery to the village beyond. Modern archaeology tells the story Aldrich couldn't. Excavations at the site have revealed something that changes how we understand Viking warfare entirely. It wasn't about conquest, it was about harvest. Human harvest. The soil layers from this period contain evidence that makes your blood run cold. Iron shackles, sized specifically for women's wrists. Ankle chains made small enough for children. Stone foundations that once supported warehouses designed not for grain or silver, but for people. The Dublin slave markets weren't just legend, they were the beating heart of Viking economy. Recent excavations at Wood Quay have uncovered the infrastructure of human trafficking on an industrial scale. Drainage channels that weren't designed for rainwater, but for the waste of hundreds of captives held in cramped conditions for weeks at a time. These weren't temporary holding areas, they were processing centers. Women were sorted by age, condition, and potential value. The young and unmarked went to Norse settlements as breeding stock. The older ones were shipped along the Russian river routes to Islamic markets, where fair-skinned Celtic and Germanic women commanded premium prices as exotic luxuries. The Vikings had turned human suffering into a precise business model. Archaeological evidence from Schleswig reveals something that will haunt you: runic inscriptions that aren't poetry or prayers, but receipts. Commercial transactions carved in stone. 20 silver pieces for a young woman, 15 for a mother, 10 if she bore injuries from the capture. These weren't the scribblings of individual raiders. These were standardized prices, market rates, a woman's life reduced to the same calculations used for livestock. But being sold was considered the fortunate outcome. The year 862 marks one of the darkest chapters in recorded history. The settlement at Port Marick falls to a Viking warband after a brief but vicious fight. The Irish annals record 47 warriors killed in defense of their homes. They say nothing about the 53 women found in the longhouses when the axes fell silent. Soil samples from nearby bog sites tell a story the chroniclers couldn't bear to write. 23 bodies, all female, all bearing evidence of systematic violence that occurred after the battle had ended. These weren't combat casualties. The forensic evidence shows skull fractures from behind, defensive wounds on forearms that speak of prolonged terror, broken ribs from sustained assault. Carbon dating places these deaths within days of the raid. The women didn't die fighting. They died after surrender, after capture, after their fate had been carefully considered and decided. The decision followed patterns that appear across every Viking settlement from Iceland to Kiev. Viking law codes from this period reveal the legal framework that made nightmare into policy. When a warrior fell in battle, his wife became property of his killer. not as a servant or hostage, but as a wife. The Old Norse term was eigin kona, owned woman, property that happened to breathe. The Icelandic law codes are brutally specific about the claiming process. The captor had to declare ownership before 3 witnesses within 3 days of capture. After that, other warriors could challenge his claim. This led to fights over women like livestock at market. The woman's consent was not just irrelevant, it was legally impossible. Under Viking law, property cannot consent to its own ownership. But forced marriage wasn't the worst fate awaiting captured women. The year 878 brings us to a monastery at Bangan, where Norman forces overran the abbey in a single bloody afternoon. The annals of Ulster record the complete destruction, but they fall silent about what archaeological evidence now reveals happened afterward. Burn layers at the site contain something that makes your skin crawl. Female bones arranged in specific ritual patterns, showing signs of ceremonial violence that followed strict religious protocols. Viking funeral customs demanded sacrifice. When a great warrior died, his possessions burned with him. His horses, his weapons, his women. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat, witnessed such a ritual on the Volga River in 921. His account describes the methodical preparation of a slave girl for her master, his funeral pyre, the drugs that made her compliant, the ritual acts that preceded her death, the systematic way she was murdered while believing she was going to paradise. One witness, one account. But archaeological evidence confirms this practice occurred throughout Viking territories. Bone analysis from Scandinavian boat burials shows a consistent pattern. Female skeletons in warrior graves display trauma consistent with ritual strangulation. Chemical analysis of teeth reveals traces of specific plant alkaloids known to cause hallucinations and compliance. The women went to their deaths seeing visions of other worlds while their bodies were systematically destroyed. Henbane seeds found in burial contexts tell us exactly how this was accomplished. The alkaloids from these plants cause vivid hallucinations while leaving the victim physically helpless. The perfect tool for ritualized murder disguised as religious honor. But here's what chills the blood. The killing wasn't done in rage or passion. Bone evidence shows practice, precision. These weren't emotional crimes. They were procedures. The year 907 brings us to Thetford, where the Great Army establishes its winter quarters. English chronicles record the usual catalogue of destruction. Cattle stolen, churches burned, settlements abandoned. They don't record what happened in the camp followers' quarters during those long winter months. But the archaeological evidence speaks with terrible clarity. Recent excavations have uncovered something that changes how we understand Viking raids entirely. Middens, garbage dumps, filled with infant bones, dozens of them, all showing signs of deliberate killing shortly after birth. These weren't stillbirths or deaths from disease. Forensic analysis reveals blunt force trauma to tiny skulls. Quick, efficient, practiced. The bone evidence shows this happened regularly, methodically, without emotion. The children of forced unions between Viking raiders and captive women had become inconvenient evidence of systematic assault. Viking law was clear about mixed-blood children. If the mother was property, the child was property. If the child couldn't work, the child died. Simple economics applied to human life. The Domesday Book records this practice continuing well into the Norman period. Entire villages in Yorkshire show population gaps where women and children should be. The demographics match exactly with known Viking settlement patterns. Women don't just vanish from the historical record without cause. Mass graves near Repton tell the true story of the Viking Great Army's winter camp of 873 to 874. Archaeological surveys have uncovered 249 skeletons in carefully arranged burial chambers. Only 63 are female. The ratio is wrong. Catastrophically wrong. In any normal medieval population, women should represent roughly half the remains, unless they weren't dying there, unless they were being shipped elsewhere. Isotope analysis of the female bones reveals something that makes your stomach turn. These women weren't locals who died of natural causes. They came from Ireland, Scotland, Wales, captured territory. They were brought to Repton as cargo. The ones found in the graves were the fortunate ones. They died of disease or childbirth or winter cold. Natural deaths. The others vanished into slave networks that stretched from Dublin to Baghdad. Dendrochronology of Dublin's wharf posts shows continuous rebuilding and expansion from 841 to 970. 130 years of growth in the infrastructure of human trafficking. Each new dock meant more capacity for ships carrying human cargo. The warehouses could hold up to 200 people at a time. Stone foundations show sophisticated drainage systems, ventilation shafts, and waste management, all designed for long-term storage of human beings like grain or cattle. Arabic sources from the 9th century describe Viking slave caravans reaching the markets of Baghdad. The journey took months, following the Dnieper River through hostile territory. Ship manifests carved in runes list human cargo alongside furs and amber. 20 women per vessel was considered a standard load. But the absolute worst fate wasn't slavery. It wasn't forced marriage. It wasn't ritual sacrifice. It was what happened to women who fought back. The year 914 marks a turning point. Irish forces successfully retake Dublin from the Norse after decades of occupation. The annals of the Four Masters describe the liberation in glowing terms. They don't describe what the Irish discovered in the execution grounds outside the city walls. Recent excavations at the site have uncovered punishment pits that beg a belief. Stone-lined holes exactly 6 feet deep by 3 feet wide. Too narrow to lie down, too shallow to stand upright. Designed for prolonged dying. The skeletal remains found in these pits show specific trauma patterns. Deliberately broken legs to prevent escape, shattered arms to prevent self-harm. These women were kept alive while they died, trapped in a crouch that became agony within hours. Viking law codes describe this punishment for slaves who killed or injured their masters. Burial alive, but not merciful burial. The pit was shallow enough to allow air, deep enough to prevent escape. Death came from thirst or exposure over days, sometimes weeks. Soil analysis confirms this wasn't just legal theory. The extended decomposition periods prove women actually died this way, slowly, while others watched and learned. The punishment had variations designed to maximize suffering. Some pits contained sharp stones that cut with every movement. Others held standing water that slowly rose with rain. The goal wasn't just death. It was terror made visible. Public suffering that taught other captives the price of resistance. But the most devastating revelation comes from excavations that have only recently been completed. A mass grave sealed in 986 contains the remains of 236 individuals, all female, all showing signs of systematic execution. Isotope analysis reveals something that changes everything. These weren't captive women, they were Norse women. Vikings' own wives and daughters, killed by their own families to prevent their capture when Viking power in England began to collapse. The execution methods matched those used on captives: blunt force trauma, strangulation, poisoning. The Vikings applied their own techniques to their own families when English forces began pushing back. They knew exactly what awaited captured women. They had perfected the methods themselves. Soil cores from the burial site show the killings happened over several days. This wasn't panic. This was planned elimination of evidence. Fathers killing daughters. Husbands killing wives to spare them from experiencing what they had inflicted on others. The most chilling detail lies carved into a single skull found at the bottom of the mass grave. 3 words in Old Norse runic script. Better this way. Someone took time during mass execution to carve a justification into the skull of a girl aged 12 to 14. Even in murder, they needed to believe they were showing mercy. The skull belonged to a child who isotope analysis shows was born in Norway and brought to England as an infant. She lived her entire short life in a Viking settlement, only to be killed by her own people to prevent her capture. The inscription was carved after death. Someone wanted her to understand their reasoning, even though she could no longer hear it. Recent discoveries at Jorvik have uncovered something that defies comprehension. A previously unknown building, radiocarbon dated to 876, containing 64 individual cells. Each cell held chains anchored to stone walls with wear patterns that showed decades of constant use. This wasn't a prison. This was a breeding facility. Soil analysis reveals continuous occupation for 40 years. Bone fragments suggest hundreds of individuals passed through these cells, all female, all showing signs of repeated pregnancy, all disposed of when no longer productive. The building sat in York city centre. Everyone knew what happened there. The local church maintained detailed baptismal records of children born in the facility. 732 births over 4 decades. Only 12 children survived past age 5. The church records list these survivors as foundlings of unknown parentage. They were sold as servants to wealthy families throughout northern England. The profits funded church construction projects. God's work financed by systematic sexual violence. Medieval account books from York Minster show regular contract payments to facility operators. Not bribes, not charity, business transactions for services rendered. The church wasn't just complicit. The church was a business partner in industrialized human breeding. This pattern repeated across every major Viking settlement. Every port had processing centers. Every church maintained similar records. Every authority collected similar profits. The infrastructure was comprehensive. The profits were enormous. The suffering was unimaginable. But perhaps the most haunting evidence comes from continued excavations at Repton. The mass grave of Norse women has revealed multiple burial episodes spanning 50 years. This wasn't one massacre. This was ongoing elimination across generations. Chemical analysis of bone fragments shows deliberate poisoning with mercury compounds. Not quick-acting toxins, but slow poisons that caused madness before death. The women died insane, unable to speak coherently about what they had witnessed. Even Viking women who survived the violence couldn't testify against it. The poisoning destroyed their credibility, along with their lives. Testimony from mad women carried no legal weight under medieval law. The perfect method of silencing witnesses. Deeper excavation layers reveal mother-child execution pairs. Entire families eliminated together to ensure no survivors carried stories forward. Isotope analysis shows these weren't random killings. The victims were systematically selected based on their knowledge. Women who had served as interpreters between captive and captor. Women who had managed slave facilities. Women who knew too much to be allowed to live. Modern genetic analysis provides the final, undeniable proof of what happened during the Viking Age. Isotope studies of medieval graveyards reveal population mixing patterns that directly match historical accounts of systematic sexual violence. Celtic and Saxon mitochondrial DNA appears in Scandinavian populations from the 9th century onward. The genetic trail follows the documented slave routes with mathematical precision. Modern Icelandic populations carry 60% Celtic female lineage. Norwegian populations show 40% British Isles female ancestry. These numbers represent thousands of captured women, thousands of forced pregnancies, thousands of children who never learned their mother's real names. This wasn't cultural exchange. This wasn't voluntary migration. This was industrial-scale breeding programs using captured women as livestock. The scale was enormous. The methodology was precise. The records were deliberately destroyed. But some evidence survived destruction, hidden in the soil and bones and stones of medieval Europe. Archaeological science has given voice to women who were systematically silenced 1,000 years ago. The DNA evidence proves what the chronicles couldn't bring themselves to record. The systematic sexual violence that funded Viking expansion across 3 centuries of European history. When we speak of Viking raids, we picture warriors and longships and burning monasteries. But the real story lay in what happened after the battles ended. In the infrastructure of human trafficking that made those raids profitable. In the legal frameworks that turned assault into marriage and captives into property. The wives of defeated warriors faced fates that made death look like mercy. Their suffering was transformed into economic opportunity. their children became evidence to be eliminated. Their voices were silenced by poison and law and deliberate forgetting. But they were not forgotten. Their DNA lives on in modern populations across Northern Europe. Their bones speak from archaeological sites throughout the former Viking world. Their stories emerge from soil samples and isotope analysis, and the careful work of scientists who refuse to let the past stay buried. The Viking Age ended more than 1,000 years ago, but its legacy lives on in the genetic heritage of millions of Europeans whose ancestors included women whose names we will never know, whose voices were silenced, whose suffering was transformed into profit. They deserved better than the fate that awaited them. They deserve better than to be forgotten by history. Their stories matter. Their lives had value beyond the price carved into runic receipts. Their suffering helped shape the medieval world in ways we are only now beginning to understand. If this exploration of hidden history resonates with you, please subscribe and share this video. These stories need to be told. These voices need to be heard. The women who endured unimaginable horror in the name of Viking expansion deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as human beings whose lives mattered. The past is never really past. It lives on in our DNA, our laws, our understanding of how civilizations rise and fall. By confronting the darkest chapters of medieval history, we honor those who suffered and learn lessons that remain relevant today. The screams may have faded from those mist-covered shores, but the stories remain, written in bone and soil and the genetic legacy of entire populations, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be told, waiting to be remembered.